Welcome to the Swisspreneur Show, a podcast about startup stories and hands-on learnings from experienced entrepreneurs. My name is Sylvan and I will be your host. Today we are back in the beautiful capital Bern and talk to the professional board member Katja Berlinger about the right setup of a board. In today's episode, you will learn the common mistakes of board members and how to avoid them, the right number of directors and their background, and also how a successful board works together and makes decisions. Before we get started with the episode, I would like to introduce you to SBB Startup. If you think that your company is a good fit for the Swiss Railways, get in touch with them or learn more about their startup programs at sbbstartup.com. Katja, welcome back to the Swisspreneur Show. Glad to have you here again.
Very glad to be here again.
Today we talk about how to build a strong board of directors. And I would like to start with the first question. What do Swiss startups often get wrong with the setup of their board of directors?
Well, it's a very general question, but I think, and I did this as well in the past, I think it's really worth spending a lot of thought about the ideal composition of your board. Because I think what happens many times is that just coincidental compositions of boards happen because somebody invested and says he or she has time, or if the company is a bit in a later stage, all of your investors want to be represented on the board. And since maybe you have 4 funds, then you have already 4 finance guys and nobody that really understands the business. And I think obviously there is a legitimate ownership to people that have invested to be on boards, but you should always also think about the real needs that you need in this board, and these are 2 different things. And sometimes you maybe have to have someone in a board because this person owns it or owns big parts of it, but then you just have to complement this person. And I think what is never good if you have too many likely-minded people, because I also believe very strongly in diversity in boards, and it's a very important point for me, not just female diversity. I think it's very important to have diversity in age, diversity in skills, diversity in backgrounds, and obviously gender is also help, but in the end it's always better to have skills than just the right gender. But and having a structured process about who would fit, and then in the end also, do the people can they work together? Can they build a team? Because in the end, if you like people you work with, it's much easier to come to good conclusions than if you're in an environment where you don't feel easy.
Let's also talk about the ideal number of people. So I think like 2 small but also 2 big boards are probably not ideal. Is there any certain amount of people that make the right board?
I fully agree that too big is not functional. I had personally very good experiences with quite small boards, so very functional 4-people boards, which had all the right skills, but were very easy to bring together if there had been an extraordinary thing to be discussed. And specifically for younger companies, if you manage to get all the necessary skills in not too many people, then I think it's easier.
So 4 would be a good number to tackle in that regard.
I don't think you can just put the right number, because it really depends on the circumstances. But I think if you have too many people, and I also believe you should only go in an early stage for people who have time. I have been in boards where people really didn't read the materials, almost fell asleep. And I mean, maybe you have a very big name, but this big name doesn't care for what you do, then it doesn't make sense.
Doesn't really help your business.
No.
How would you then deal with people that maybe say like, yeah, they have time, but then when you actually start working with them, you realize that they actually don't have time? How do you deal with that once you already have them on the board?
It depends on the role you have. I mean, if you really have a powerful role, then obviously you have to kick them out. If you're new in a very political board, and it can become very difficult. And if you're lucky, you can just ignore because they don't hurt if they don't do anything. But if it's then more, then I think then you have to find the adequate way to address it with powerful people who then take care.
Right. You also mentioned the different skill sets or backgrounds. So what should you look for in your board to have?
I think there are general roles that have to be covered, like you have to make sure that somebody understands the legal and the financial backgrounds. Obviously, this is a must. Then obviously you need an industry expert, and depending on what you do, ideally you have somebody who has been on a journey before with whatever you plan, so you can get experience. But also there, I think sometimes I also have been on boards where I hadn't been extremely experienced in the industry. I think sometimes it's very good to have an outsider. Mm-hmm. Then it just has to be someone that has a very clear role. So for example, to say either I'm somebody, or for myself, I was good in building up companies or like reinvent them, like if they were more mature. Because sometimes, or even now, I see this is the big problem of many mature companies, that they are successful, that they found their processes, but they lost a bit the agility and the ways to really get ready for the future. Mm-hmm. And they are all very stressed about digitalization, and they believe they need these huge processes, but in the end, it's also a lot is about people, a lot is about culture, a lot is about how you tackle change. And in my case, I think this is something I can really bring also to a board. And I mentioned this for me now. I think it's important that you know what the people in your board bring to the table. And again, not just a name, it should be a skill. Mm-hmm. And then it has to fit, obviously, the needs of each company.
Absolutely. Then also from a startup perspective, you often also have the discussion whether you should have the founders on the board. What do you think about that?
I said in the first episode, I think as soon as the founders have a majority, or maybe even like above 30%, mm-hmm. and if they really have big skin in the game, it's a different story, and I think they must also be represented on the board. I think if they have less parts, then obviously from a controlling perspective, if they're operational, it's nowadays the good corporate governance setup that they are not on the board. Right. But as I said before, I come from a background of family firms, and if you own a company, then I think actually it's like der wohltätige Diktator, like somebody with a lot of power who uses this power not for only himself, but mm-hmm. for the bigger good for everyone, can be very, very strong and powerful leader. And in family firms, sometimes this works really well because it's their money and their future so they have a big interest to make sure all the stakeholders also are well. So, and I'm a bit scared sometimes today the corporate governance discussion goes a bit through the roof because it originates in the principal agent theory. And it's very important in companies where the shareholders and the owners have little or no power anymore. And there, obviously, it's an extreme must that you have a division between board and operational Absolutely. Lead. But if ownership is the same, and if the company is doing really well, I think we should be free enough to look also at this from a bit different perspective. Mm-hmm. And therefore also there is not a clear yes or no, founders or not. But I still think the difficult task with founders is that if companies grow very fast, there may be the moment where founders are not the right executives anymore.
Yeah.
And if they are on the board and then also operationally working, and if you have to have these discussions, it sometimes doesn't help. And I think in any case, these decision-taking organizations, they have to make sure that they can freely speak and that they can trust everyone they speak about, because it's their duty to also tell a founder that he should not be a CEO anymore when it's the best thing for the company.
Yeah. Is there any good tip or recommendation from your side how to create this good environment that they actually also get this honest and open feedback?
Obviously, it's trust. I think it's like everywhere. Boards are teams, and if you enable an environment where you foster a good atmosphere, and if you sometimes address openly that there are things that you would like to discuss without somebody here just because you believe it's important, I think it's different than if you just start doing hidden phone conferences or whatever. I think also there if you have structured processes which specifically foresee that there is like 10 minutes in front of each board meeting without the CEO. So the board has the opportunity to discuss certain issues. Then it's not a big deal, and it's not making the CEO feeling weird when it's just done once in a while, and then he believes in the beginning of the meeting what do they talk about or whatever. So I think it's also about good processes and good standards, and then things become more easy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another delicate question that often arises is, how do you actually pay your board as a startup? Many startups don't pay or sort of compensate through equity. What is your take on this? How do you best compensate your board?
I think it's important that you find a mechanism that also, I think one part of the compensation should compensate for risk you overtake by just joining a board. That doesn't need to be a big amount of money, but I think it is a risk, and a lot of people don't realize that it's not just about the number of board mandates, but actually with every board mandate comes a huge responsibility.
Maybe you can also quickly explain that, because I think not all people are aware of the risk that you actually are involved with as a board member.
Well, the risks can become very high, specifically if you're involved, as I say, if people cheat. I mean, obviously you try your best to do good corporate governance and processes, but if people really have a bad agenda, normal people don't believe that people would have that. So if you're lied upon or whatever, then things can happen that you don't realize, but sometimes also just businesses go bad. And as a board member, you're basically the main responsible person if things go wrong. Obviously, you can delegate certain, but not all tasks. There, Swiss law is very specific. You cannot delegate everything. So you have to still have a certain overview, and there are certain also financial book entries also, which I recommend every board member to look at, because there are also certain legal areas where you can personally be liable. And a lot of people don't know about this. And I think in the last years it has become a bit hip to be on boards, and a lot of people believe you make a lot of money and just don't have a lot of work. But I think the risk associated with it is underestimated. And I'm not saying, I think it's a wonderful job, because you have, if you have the right teams, you can influence also a lot. But I think you should also be very humble and aware of also the duties. And that's why I think not paying at all is, well, maybe that's an option if you own a lot of the company, then it's maybe a different story. But even then, I think it's more hygienic if you just pay a little bit, because if you don't pay, it's not worth, and you don't understand that it's also serious.
I know this is incredibly difficult, but what means a little bit in terms of numbers?
I think it can also be 5,000. Honestly, Swiss, even bigger companies like the KMUs, I think that the typical board mandate pays maybe between 5,000 and 15,000 Swiss francs a year. And associated with this, if it's only 4 meetings, then it's a very good payment.
Sure.
But if it's a big crisis and you start working every week several days or whatever, then maybe, I mean, it's still a lot of money, but I think that's why I always, in my cases, I think there should be a fixed compensation, be it in shares or in a fixed salary for this risk and for just going there. And then there can be variable components that are variable also with the amount of time you dedicate. I think this is the most fair solution because you never know what happens. And I think if you really go into crisis and if it's necessary that you work a lot, then it should also be more compensated than if you just have regular meetings 4 times a year.
That makes sense. Yeah. And where do you actually find the right board members, especially as a startup? What would you recommend a startup where they can find their board members?
Well, I think it's very important that the ideal case, at least in my life, has been that there was a past experience of working with someone, because then you know what you get. And as I say, I think the names and positions are overrated. I think the interaction and the possibility, specifically in an early stage, to reach out to a board member in an uncomplicated way is much more valuable. And sometimes I also think I would rather take a young, ambitious person that really wants to be on a board than somebody who has 50 board mandates and thinks, oh my God, I can't handle a lot. You don't want to be the unimportant one, specifically because the responsibility is high. And that's why, I mean, I got all my own board mandates or the people I asked to be on boards because I used to work with them. And then I knew they have the skill I'm looking for. Because sometimes it's not so easily to tell from a CV what it is. Yeah. Obviously, these whole business angel clubs, if you can get smart investors which have experience in a field of building or scaling up companies and at the same time put skin in the game. I mean, this is ideal. But I would not just go for big names. I would be a bit picky and try to make sure that you like these people. I think the general advice, if you can work with people you come along with well, it just, first of all, then it's not a waste of your time. You like to go to the meetings. Yeah, it's just easy. I think it's for everything in life. Try to be surrounded by good people.
Sure, but still make sure that they have the diverse backgrounds, right? That they bring that to the table.
Exactly, yeah.
One other question is in terms of, once the companies grow, how does the role of the people or the size, etc., also shift over time?
I think the bigger the companies get, the more professional the board must become and the less operational it's allowed to be. Okay. I think in smaller environments, it's very common that operational and strategic questions are more a bit gradually discussed in the board or in the management. And I also think interactions are less structured and they are just more opportunity driven when it's needed. Right. And I think if you have big companies, it's very important that you understand your role as a board member and that you don't drive management crazy because you start doing their jobs. Yes. And also in smaller environments, I think if your skills really are not in the company and if the company asks you as a board member whether you would like to overtake certain things, I think it's very important to get a very clear idea about what is this task? Is it paid or is it not paid? How long should it be? And should it just be an interim solution or whatever? Because I think it's still, there should be a division between board and management and the roles should be well perceived.
So now let's assume you set up your board successfully, you found the right people with the right background. Now you basically have the board set up and you start working together. First question is, why is the board of directors actually crucial for your business success and what do they actually do? It's like the very generalistic question.
Well, the board has, even by law, has to make the overall strategy of the company and has the overall responsibility that it all works fine. So it's the most, basically it's, I mean, you can have a company without a management, but you never can have, in Switzerland at least, one without a board. So it's an important role. And I think as an entrepreneur, it's in the ideal case, you also appreciate your board as a challenge and somebody who brings you further. It shouldn't be, I think, the biggest risk for a company is if management perceives board as a bad controlling organ. And management can hide things if they want. And if it's just like a tick the box thing and you're just showing a nice world, being happy that it's over, and then you go back and believe, I'm glad I don't have to see these people anymore. Right. Then I think you don't make good use of your and these other people's time. And I think a board is an extremely good mechanism to be challenged and to get new insights and to continuously improve yourself. And that's how it should be. Obviously, it's not always with every person in the same easy way, but I think it should be in the genuine interest also of the management to really perceive the board as this.
You also talked about the two levels, the operational level, more left to the management, and the strategic level, more left to the board. Can you give us like examples how to really clearly differentiate these two levels, and also explain when it makes sense for the board to be involved in operational tasks and when absolutely not?
Speaking for bigger companies, I think the only operational thing the board should do is leading the CEO of the company, or depending on the governance structure of the company, leading the whole management. Yeah. Choosing it, making sure it's the right people, and also motivating them. And in big structures otherwise, then you should more or less let the operational stuff be prepared by the management and really just supervise. In smaller companies, as I say, it can become more mixed, specifically also if the board members are also shareholders. Sure. And then maybe they do representative, they start helping gaining sales or new clients or whatever. I mean, this is then purely operational. I think then it's just important that it's understood that both parties really believe that makes sense. And then it's about communication and setting it up correctly. Yeah.
And if there's a crisis that hits you, like the fraud case that you mentioned, is the board then also getting more active on an operational level?
You have to, because then you have to also dig. I mean, then you have, if you have evidence that not everything has been by the book, it becomes your obligation to make sure it goes back to the normal stage, or you find out. You have to organize most of the time an investigation to make sure things go and that you live up to your responsibility.
And the next part is, how do you actually collaborate with the board? Like, how often should a board meet? What is the best practice there?
All the questions you ask are not with a clear answer. I think in smaller companies that run well and have no crisis and no big changes coming up, I think one board meeting a quarter is the minimum, so that you stay a bit tuned and know what's going on. Right. Here at Insel, we have a board meeting every month, and I think it's also a very big organization. And but I think one a month for a real only strategic board is probably, I think it shouldn't be more. So I think the bandwidth is between once a quarter and once a month, depending on the needs of the company and size of the organization. And obviously, if crisis occurs, then it can become a very regular work.
Absolutely. And how should the board actually communicate and also collaborate in between the meetings? Is there any communication? How do you work with each other besides the board meeting, if at all?
Also depends completely on the situation of the company. I think if it's, I'm not a big fan of just all these side discussions and everything is already decided when the people come. I think, I mean, yes, it's a way to use control, but I think if you want to have use of the board you put together, then it's better if somehow you manage to bring all the people in on one page. But I think if you have people that have specific skills and then in the company there is some demand, I think it's just important that sometimes there can also be interaction with the CEO. I don't think there is a clear rule. And yes, I think it's not a failure if two board members discuss something they felt not 100% well covered in a board meeting, that they take some time to reflect. Sure. Because then I think it's a sign that they do a diligent job. What they do about it afterwards, I think, has to be well reflected and to be made sure that then the whole board can be on the same level again.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And how do you actually go about making decisions? Obviously, you can vote on things. I can imagine that they can also be like pat situations where you don't really find a conclusion.
I've never... I think I had one board decision which was not unanimous. And I think good boards actually discuss so long so that the decisions afterwards are not really difficult. Okay. So I think if you fear decisions that are in pat, I think then you need to spend more time on the discussions. Right. And I actually only perceived it like this so far.
That speaks for very good boards that you're part of.
I hope. I feel that the boards I'm in are very good, but I mean, you can also always be better, but yeah.
Also, one part is you served on many boards already and still do. Like, are there any common best practices that you can share, that you basically learned during your career as a professional board member that were not obvious or that you would have not expected during that time?
For a person like myself that likes to speak a lot, I think when you start, definitely in the first meeting, sometimes probably good to first adapt a bit and understand a bit the roles. And I sometimes also think it's good to be a bit aware of the speaking time you need, or I reflect a lot on which points I would really like to make. I usually have many points, but then I also have to wait a bit and see which ones are really my most important ones. I think this is also a bit, because in a board it's not about just speaking because you have something to say, but you should also, try to make the best out of the time of everyone. And otherwise I think it's about respect. It's respect also, and preparation. Okay, preparation is also part of respect, because for the people that really present something, that you're there and present. And
how do you prepare for a board meeting?
It's a lot of reading, and sometimes if you read about things you don't really 100% specialist. Sometimes it's also Google, using the internet to make sure you understand what it's all about. I think you don't always have to understand 100% of everything, but I would recommend to go out of a board if you have half of the time the feeling that you have to decide on things that you have no clue about. Then I think the responsibility and risk to do something wrong is not worth the money you're paid.
Does it also occur that you come in with an opinion, because of your preparation, then you discuss with the board and then you completely change?
Yeah, that's why I said I do like a triage. I think I'm a person, I have very fast an opinion on everything. But I think there are issues that are not in my absolute core competency and that that I can listen to without this very strong feeling in my belly. And then I also sometimes think, come on, it should be fine and it's not so important. But there are other issues where I really believe if I don't say something now, I feel really bad, and I also feel like that I would a bit abuse my responsibility by not speaking up, and there I have a very strong feeling, and then I also then I can't be quiet, and I don't say you can't change your mind then, but I also think it's worth fighting then a bit, and good boards should also allow that, and I don't think you have to be 100% of the same opinion. But I think you should be able to say, I don't, maybe I'm not, I would have voted differently before the meeting, but after a very good discussion, I can live, even without the specific mention in the meeting minutes, that I'm completely against. And I mean, that you should also do if you're completely against, because it's the only thing you have in the past, in the future, if it really goes wrong,
Sure.
is your disconsent in writing.
Yeah. So to summarize this episode, I prepared a special rapid fire questions for you.
Whoa.
So I will give you 6 choices, always 2 choices to choose from, and then you basically make one choice and quickly explain why you made that choice.
All right.
Okay? So financial wealth or health?
Health.
Why?
Obviously, well, yeah. It's the only thing you can't buy, and it is not very good if you have billions and you're about to die. So
I think it's also very clear from the values that you shared with us that this is a clear choice. Women quotas, yes or no?
No.
Why is that?
It would be a yes, no, maybe. I used to be very strong against quotas because I hated to be considered to be somewhere just because I'm a woman. And I think it's a very big disappreciation of women that do good jobs when they just believe to be there because they are from the right gender.
Absolutely.
But going back to the things we discussed in episode 1, maybe I also understand that our society maybe needs some pressure, and then I think we will see some quotas. So
okay, so we stay tuned for the development there.
Yes, we'll see.
Motivation or discipline?
Motivation.
I think that also makes sense of your first story. Learning or doing?
Doing.
That's the entrepreneurial DNA, I guess. Strategy or execution?
Execution.
Why?
Yeah, obviously I like to do strategy, but I'm a very operational person, and I like doing these I like being strategic in a board, but for example in Swiss Medikits it gives me a lot of joy doing operational excellence. That's
probably also why you are so passionate about this project, because there you can live your operational.
And it's not always big things you change, you know. Sometimes it's really a bit pedantic, but this is, I think making good services even better is something very nice.
Right.
Yeah.
And the last one that will be tricky: Bern or Zurich?
Oh, it's a tough one, no. But I think the Bern will forgive me. The people from Bern. I'm a very big fan of Zurich, and I think I lived in many places of the world, but I still think Zurich is the most wonderful city.
Fair point.
Yeah, and it's not. Bern is very wonderful as well, but Zurich is a bit more cosmopolitan. And I always think every person should once a year go to another continent to understand that not everything is good how we do it here. And I think you have a little bit more of this international feeling in Zurich.
And that's something that you would wish for more Swiss cities?
I think it's very important that we are not too narrow-minded and that we accept positive influence from other cultures and countries.
Talking about diversity again, right?
Exactly.
Of course, your answer hurts my Bernese heart because I grew up close to Bern, but
I love Bern.
I can understand your choice too.
It was a tough one.
Katja, thank you so much for taking the time. It was a pleasure and a lot of fun talking to you.
Same.
And we wish you all the best for your board positions and, of course, also for Swiss Medikits. It's
Thank you so
fantastic project.
Thanks. And all the best to you as well. You do a very good job in inspiring people.
Thank you very much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed the content, we would be thrilled to receive your rating on Apple Podcasts. That way you not only support Swisspreneur, but also help other entrepreneurs discovering the show and finding more valuable information on how to run their businesses. Next week, we will already be back with an all new episode of the Swisspreneur Show, so we hope to see you again then for a new episode.